Welcome to the second installment of our risk management videos. You may remember me from such videos as risk identification, which we looked at previously during the feasibility phase of a project. Before we get into the topics today though, let's have a quick reminder of two key concepts from the previous video. Firstly, the idea that how bad a risk is depends on its likelihood of happening and its potential impact or consequence. Secondly, that risk comes from many different sources and categories. It's not just about safety or environmental risks. So moving on to parts 2 and 3 of the risk theme, risk analysis and risk response. So risk analysis first, which is taking that likelihood and potential impact concept and putting a more exact and rigorous process around it. So the likelihood or the probability of any risk can be described on a scale of 1 to 5, with 1 being a very small likelihood, i.e. rare, and 5 being almost certain to happen. And then we have steps 2, 3, and 4 in between. For the potential impact or the consequence of that risk, a similar 1 to 5 scale can be applied as well. The same as the 1 to 5 scale for likelihood, a 1 in the impact scale means it's a fairly insignificant impact. And a 5 in that scale means it's a severe or catastrophic outcome. And there are impact ratings for the 2, 3, and 4 scales as well. So how are those ratings applied and why do the 1 to 5 scales matter? Well, it's used like a matrix. Something that has a likelihood or a probability of 5 out of 5, so it's almost certain to happen, and also has a 5 out of 5 on the impact or consequence scale would be considered an extreme risk. And we can give it a number as well that represents that score. That risk score is calculated by multiplying the likelihood score by the consequence score. So a 5 times 5 equals 25. The higher that final risk score, the bigger danger the risk is. And so the more time, cost, and effort you need to put into managing that risk. And the same process applies for all the other combinations of likelihood and impact as well, which gives us the full risk matrix where we have some extreme risks, we have some high risks, some medium ones, some low level ones, and some very low risks. So that's how we use a risk matrix to perform a risk analysis. Now, I want you to do an activity for me. I want you to open a new browser window and Google image search for risk matrix. I'll wait right here. So these are some of the results. You can see that some of the images are not exactly the same. So some risk matrices use the 1 to 5 scale that we've just looked at, but perhaps they use different words. Some risk matrices might use a 1 to 3 scale instead of a 1 to 5, or they might use that's a 1 to 3, there we can see, or it might use a 1 to 4 scale. Some might have level of high, where others might have it as a level of a medium or an extreme for the same combination of impact and likelihood. So the point I'm getting to here is that there are many variations out there, but they all operate on the same principle of likelihood times impact equals degree of risk. And every organization that you work in will have a slightly different matrix and a slightly different policy around risk management. So now let's move on to risk responses. There are generally 4 ways a company can respond to a risk. These are to avoid or eliminate the risk, reduce the degree of risk, transfer it, or to just accept it. Let's look at each of these using a worked example. Let's say that the risk is being in a car accident and writing off your car. And we've analysed it as having a major impact, an unlikely likelihood, so it has a medium level of risk with a score of 8. So one response could be to somehow avoid or eliminate the risk entirely. This means that somehow we remove that risk completely. In our example, we could never take the car out of the garage and never drive anywhere. No longer getting into a car means there's no longer even a rare chance that you'll damage the car in a road accident. The second possible response is about reducing the risk, or what we call mitigating the risk. That word, mitigation, is just one of those few jargon keywords that you just need to learn. It is used in every industry when talking about risk management, and it really just means how have you reduced the level of that risk. So to mitigate in our example, we could reduce the likelihood or reduce the impact somehow. So in our car accident example, is there anything you could do to reduce the impact? Well, we could only drive on roads that have low speed limits in our local neighborhood. The slower you're driving, the less damage you'll do if you hit something. But maybe that isn't feasible. So is there a way we can reduce the likelihood of it happening? Well, we could only drive during the daytime, never in the rain or the fog. We could always make sure we follow the road rules. We could even take a defensive driving course to become a better driver. So there are actually quite a few mitigation measures we could take there. How about transferring the risk, which is the third response type? Well, we could take out a comprehensive car insurance policy that says that if the car is in an accident, it would be replaced or fixed for the cost of a few $100s rather than paying thousands and thousands of dollars. What we're actually doing is transferring the risk of the accident and the damage costs to the insurance company. We are paying that company some money so they wear the risk instead of us. Insurance is a common way of transferring risks. Another way of transferring the risk is to form a partnership, so you can share the risk with someone else. Let's say you have a friend who gets a ride with you to uni every day. Perhaps you make an agreement that if an accident happens while you're both in the car, you'll share the costs. They get free transport out of the deal, and you only take on half the risk. Winner, winner, chicken dinner. The last option is just to accept the risk. Don't have the money for comprehensive car insurance, or maybe the policy costs more than the car is even worth, or maybe you're just a really careful driver. In those cases, you're probably just going to choose to accept that risk. Every day in your life, you are performing risk management. You probably just aren't even aware of it. So if you have an in-class test coming up soon, maybe you catch an earlier train to make sure you get there on time. You've assessed the risk and responded with a mitigation measure of reducing the impact of a late train. Met a girl or a boy you really like, but decided not to ask them out for a coffee or a drink because you're worried about the risk they'll say no? Well, you've assessed that no risk as too high and chosen to avoid it completely by not even asking. Taken that holiday overseas so you could go party on the beach, even though your parents said it was too dangerous and that you shouldn't go? Well, your risk assessment said it was fine, so you accepted the risk and went anyway. See, humans have an inbuilt risk management part of their brain, and each of us has a different level of risk that we are willing to accept. Alright, so enough about human behaviour, let's get on to the fun stuff, the forms and the registers. It might surprise you, but there is a table or a register you can fill in to document the risks on your project. It's a risk register and it looks like this. It has columns for the risk description, the impact, likelihood, the final rating, and the mitigation measures that you're putting in place. It can also include columns where you can write things like the cost of that mitigation measure, a timeline, a person responsible for monitoring the risk, and any relevant WBS work package or activity. Alright, so that covers the risk analysis and risk response. Let's have a look at just one review question. Using the Christmas lights case study, come up with one risk from any category and write out your analysis for the likelihood and the impact and the final rating. Include the descriptive words and also the numbers for all three of those. You do not have to come up with any mitigation measures, alright? So write out that risk, bring it to class, make sure that you've identified the likelihood, the impact, and the rating with both the word and the number. All right, so that wraps up the risk analysis and response. Later on, we'll look at risk control during the execution phase of the project.